Hello, this is Lynn Fraser with the Radical Recovery Summit. I'm excited today to bring you an interview with Nicole Marcia. She is a yoga therapist and a trauma-informed yoga therapist and teacher. She trains yoga and healthcare professionals internationally, is a member of the Breathe Network, which connects survivors of sexual violence with healing arts practitioners, and is a service provider for first responder health. When I spoke to her in our first summit in 2017, we spoke primarily about the yoga therapy work she was doing with addictions and mental health. We continue that conversation today and talk about what's happening and what's changing in the world of trauma therapy and addictions and mental health. In our conversation, she broadens the work around being a trauma-informed yoga therapist into working with systemic oppression. Many people feel overwhelmed right now, and she talks about bringing our whole self into this work in community. The last several years have been so interesting around trauma therapy and yoga therapy around trauma and embodiment and just the different view that people have on it now than what they used to.
Mm-hmm.
So this is really an exciting opportunity for me to get a chance to get your perspective on that. Something that, because as an old timer, so to speak, in the field of healing trauma, and healing trauma and addiction in particular.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, there's a lot there. When you were talking, I was just thinking about how, when I first started doing this work of, yoga therapy to support folks who are trauma survivors and maybe also dealing with substance use. I used to tell people the work that I was doing, in 2010, and they would look at me kind of sideways. And now when I talk about that same work, I feel like it lands in a completely different way. Like this idea that we can address some of the impact of traumatic experience somatically is way more out in the popular, like in the mainstream than it used to be. It's much more widely accepted. And in fact, I had a professor in my trauma course in my counseling program a while back say flat out, trauma isn't resolved cognitively, resolved somatically. And, this is in a counseling program.
Wow.
Yeah, a statement coming from a psychologist. So that was sort of interesting. So I agree with you. Like the landscape has definitely changed over the last 13 years. Since I've been involved in the work. And obviously there are many, many people who have been doing this work longer than I have. And certainly over the pandemic, this work has changed. And one of the big pieces I've really noticed is a much more pronounced understanding of oppression being a form of trauma.
Right. The social justice, systemic oppression, how that all feeds in.
Yeah. And again, applying that somatic work through that framework has been also really interesting and really challenging and very humbling, coming to that work and that perspective from a place of a great deal of privilege and really starting to take my own blinders off around systemic oppression and how traumatic that is, in particular for BIPOC folks. So yeah, the work's been really different.
Yeah. So when we talked you were part of the first Radical Recovery Summit in 2017. So that's a long time ago now too. And the world has changed so much since then. I mean, not just COVID, but also like you were saying, the world of understanding trauma and it has to be healed somatically. And now this social justice and oppression coming much more to the forefront. And it's not mainstream yet, but it's certainly they're very rich conversations that are happening about that. When we talked before, you were working at an addictions center doing yoga therapy with people with addiction. Do you want to take us kind of into what that was like and what's your path been in the last 6-7 years?
Yeah, well, that feels like it was a long time ago. So I worked from around 2010 to 2017 full-time as a yoga therapist in a place called the Burnaby Centre for Mental Health and Addictions. And ultimately, I came to split my time between the Burnaby Centre and Riverview Psychiatric Hospital. And again, I did that from about 2010 to 2017. And then also for about a decade was working as a yoga therapist at Onsite, which is the rehab arm of the Safe Injection site in the downtown Eastside. In addition to, teaching some class series at other treatment centers. So I was pretty entrenched in the world of, what's often called concurrent disorders. So folks who are living both with, substance use issues and a mental health diagnosis. And, as I often say, I had absolutely no idea what I was doing for the first year, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And subsequent years, I like to think, I was learning and building upon my skill set. One of the most important sort of pivotal parts of my work was discovering trauma-centered, trauma-sensitive yoga and really getting what I think is a very common understanding now, but at that time, and in particular for me, really getting that what I was working with wasn't necessarily substance misuse. What I was working with was the trauma that was underneath that substance use, and also the trauma that was often underneath a lot of the other mental health diagnoses that, my clients and students were living with. And so professionally and personally, that really opened things up for me. Personally, what got opened up for me was me being able to connect the dots between the very violent sexual assault that I had survived in my early 20s and my own dance with substance use.
Mm-hmm.
So really, my work has just kind of built since then. And these days, I'm doing a fair amount of work with teenagers who have mental health diagnosis. I'm doing some work with women who are fleeing situations of human trafficking, so both labor and sexual exploitation. I also train yoga teachers and mental health professionals and yoga therapists in trauma-informed yoga theory and techniques. And I'm seeing folks in private practice as well. I've also had the opportunity through Yoga Outreach, a nonprofit organization where I'm the director of teacher training and mentorship, to co-develop and co-deliver some programs with Indigenous communities and do a little bit of work there. So the path has been interesting. And I guess, again, as someone who's coming from a fair bit of privilege, one of the pieces of unpacking that I've had to do is the recognizing that trauma isn't something that happened in the past. And we see this in particular with COVID, but we also see it, with folks who are experiencing ongoing oppression and microaggressions, that for many of the people that I'm working with, trauma is something that's happening every day. So the work is very different than when I was working more from the assumption of, okay, there's something that happened in the past that's alive somatically in the present, and we're going to work with integrating that somehow.
Yeah, and it's like any wound, if it keeps getting irritated and pushed at and pecked at, it's going to be a lot harder to heal.
Yeah, and we also start to see that healing needs to take place on a much larger basis. So, again, I'm seeing a big shift in this conversation around self-regulation. And I'm seeing more in the field of co-regulation, like the importance of what's happening right here, right now, the importance of understanding that our health and our well-being is really intrinsically linked. And COVID showed us this too, intrinsically linked to one another, how our health and well-being is intrinsically linked to the environment that we live in. Like if we don't get that by now, these practices need to be not only practical, but people are starting to get very curious about how this work not only addresses trauma, but how it might serve as a path towards social justice and liberation. What does it mean for someone who has been historically an ongoing, and experiencing ongoing oppression to feel empowered, to feel embodied? What is there for them to do with that transformation? And also, what is there for me to be doing in terms of leveraging my own privilege, my access to embodiment practices how am I leveraging that for a greater change in the world so that we're not just addressing historical trauma, but, we're using this work to address trauma in the present time.
Mhm. So when you look at how that's changed the work that you do, that shift from it's in the past, in our body in the present, but it's also now this deeper and deeper understanding of ongoing systemic oppression. What is it that changes in your approach and how people are working with that?
It becomes important to unpack the work in a different way. So there's this piece of it that's like, here's something that you can do in the moment when you're having trouble on the ground regulating. Here's some stuff you can do in the background, in order to support your ongoing ability to function within your window of capacity. And then this larger piece of now, how will we be in action out in the world? If that's something that, a client is interested in, have you connect into community? How can we support you in pushing back? How can I support that? And I think also just becoming a lot, as I said before, like becoming a lot more aware of how I'm leveraging my own privilege as a therapist. I never really thought about that very much before because when you have a lot of privilege, you have a lot of blind spots. So I'm a lot more aware of how everything I do is political, from the ways in which I do and don't give access to my services, to what I'm doing with my spare time, to where I'm spending my money, to attending rallies or, everything that I'm doing is political. So I see myself in a different way and I see what's possible for my clients in a different way.
That's true to my experience too, is that one of the things that happened for me in the 70s and 80s was I was very active in social change, feminist, lesbian, anti-racist work, and then into the AIDS movement in the late 80s and 90s. And one of the things that that did for me was that it gave me a sense of agency. I overcame a sense of powerlessness and of not being worthy. And it was through the direct experience of being together with other people who we saw the world in a way that was really clear. And we really saw these are some of the things that need to change. These are wrong. It's wrong. Hierarchy is wrong. It's
Mm.
colonization is wrong. And so how can we get together? And that feeling of, healing trauma is an individual journey and it takes place within this wider context of connection. And
Yes.
that's something that I wasn't thinking about at all at the time.
Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
just doing my thing out there, organizing. But it was
Yeah.
really
So
important, that connection.
So I think that like what I'm going through is not specific to me or necessarily specific to this time, right? It's perhaps one potential journey that someone who works in the field of trauma comes to understand in their own way, and in their own time, hopefully.
Mhm.
And it's been particularly interesting because I think that groups are very important, for this work. Individual work can be really important, and I think group work is incredibly important. And for me, that really, in many areas of my work, really stopped during COVID.
Mm.
I just stopped any kind of public group teaching, basically. I was doing a little bit online, but it's not really my jam.
Mhm.
Teaching asana classes, online just was not what I wanted to do. And now I find myself spending so much time in front of the computer, but so many yoga studios have closed down. So I haven't come to a place yet in my work where I've reestablished that group. And I miss that.
There's something about our warm mammal bodies being together in the same room.
Yeah.
I find it's very powerful to work online too. And there is something different about that.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm able to see people in person now, which I love. It's just the group work hasn't quite happened yet.
Right. So you mentioned a few minutes ago about things we can do in the moment and then things we can do kind of in the background. to support healing trauma. Can you expand a bit on that?
Sure. So often when I have folks come to me, in particular in my private practice, they're interested in understanding how to use their breath and their bodies as a resource,
Mhm.
for self and collective regulation. But they're not necessarily wanting to wake up early in the morning and, do an asana practice for an hour and a half, you
Mhm.
know? And sometimes when we set the bar up there, we don't always fulfill that. And so it can be sort of discouraging. So I'm always looking for ways to make practices really practical. So that could look like, okay, today we're going to be exploring grounding and nostril breath and lengthening your exhale.
Mhm.
This is something you can do when you're standing in line and you're getting impatient. It's something you can do when you're about to move into that kind of conversation that can be confronting or dysregulating with a coworker. It's something you can do in your transition from work to home. This is actually a lot of the work that I was doing with first responders as well as like working with transitions. So those are those on the spot and self-regulating practices. And then there can be larger, more sort of ritualized practices. But for the most part, really, Lynn, like when I say larger, I'm looking at maybe 10, 15 minutes. So for instance, I'll say to a client, what's something you do every day? And the client might say, well, I walk my dog in the morning. So I'll say, does it make sense to wake up a little earlier in the morning and take 10 minutes to practice this? So yeah, hopefully if that's an option, then I'm giving them a practice that they can practice every day or, however many times in the week that they want, with the understanding that they can access these practices like medicine. If you practice, if you explore this medicine, it will work. If you don't, it won't. No judgment either way. I know what life is like. So there's things that we do in the moment. And then there's something that's a little bit more formal, a little more ritualized that symbolizes I'm putting this time aside in order to nurture myself. And in doing so, nurture my relationships in my life with the people that matter the most to me.
Mhm. And those would be breathing, or what kind of practices would those be?
Breathing in a way that supports whatever's up for the person. So if they're dealing with more depressive symptoms, low mood, it might be practices that are a little more energized. And same thing with some physical forms. So if they're dealing with some anxiety, we might explore some ways of increasing activity in the parasympathetic nervous system. Certainly, grounding is a piece that I go to. And I'm often encouraging my clients to add something else into that feels like a ritual. It may be a candle, it may be some kind of altar, it may just be a space that they create for themselves in the morning. But I think some kind of ritual or ceremony is really important, especially for white settlers who have often sort of lost touch with their own ceremony and ritual and starting to create that as a sacred and intentional space. I think that has some therapeutic benefit to it in and of itself. It can also include things like intention setting for the day, gratitude practice, working with emotions that come up somatically and sort of practicing that. Depends on who's in front of me and what they're communicating around their needs. Yeah.
Mhm. So you've done a lot of training and a lot of work in trauma-informed yoga practice. What are
Mhm.
you seeing in terms of the changes in that over the last several years? Do you feel like most yoga classes are now more trauma-informed? Do you feel like there's a big issue there that we really need to be focusing on? What's your sense of that?
My supervisor said to me the other day, there's a big difference between being trauma informed and doing trauma work.
Mhm.
And I think that that's very important. So, as someone who has done a fair bit of training, but also has trained many people,
Right.
I think that for the most part, what's happening is that yoga teachers are understanding how to create safer, more courageous and connected environments in some of their studio classes. I think that's happening. So I think that work is far more widely recognized and woven into what a lot of yoga teachers are doing. Now, does that mean that they're doing trauma work specifically? No, I don't think that they are, but they're creating these trauma-informed environments. At the same time, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're creating like oppression-informed spaces. And it can be hard to do that within a capitalist structure, which is, part of what yoga studios are woven into. I think that there are not a lot of yoga teachers and yoga therapists who would say that they work specifically with trauma. That's the focus of their work, but that's growing. And for sure, the Center for Trauma and Embodiment is responsible for training a lot of those yoga professionals. So I think that's growing. I think trauma work that's happening within the context of a yoga or yoga therapy relationship is growing. I think that trauma-informed practice in yoga studios has grown quite a bit. But I think the oppression-informed piece is slower. But we know that it's hard to create anti-oppressive structures underneath a oppressive structure. If that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. What would a shift look like then if we're moving towards more of a anti-oppressive or anti-oppression, an acknowledgement of systemic oppression? What would the change be for people? What would that look like?
Well, I think we really need to confront issues of cultural appropriation within yoga. I think that yoga practitioners and yoga teachers and yoga therapists need to find a way themselves and in community with BIPOC folks and in particular South Asian communities, find a place of integrity and humility within that reality. That's a huge part of it. I think, again, really recognizing who yoga studios, in terms of how they are structured right now, who isn't in the room, really being present to who's not there and getting curious about why. What do the bodies look like that are in this space? How do these bodies move? What's the socioeconomic status? Seeing what's there and what's not. And really being in action in order to address that. I think also creating more curated spaces for specific populations of folks who are not only interested in practicing yoga, but interested in learning how to share it, how to facilitate it. I don't think that we see a lot of variation in yoga teachers in general, in Vancouver at least. I can sort of speak from what I see here. There isn't a ton of diversity.
Right. Those are some of the elements. And it's difficult to thinking about inclusion and welcoming and who isn't here and why and how can we, work with that. There's so many kind of obvious things like let's try not to misgender people. Let's use the appropriate pronouns. There's some things like that that are maybe not at the top of mind for people, but that aren't going to be that hard, hopefully, to kind of bring to top of mind. And yet there's such a defensiveness. And I think people are so overwhelmed too. A lot of it's like, I can barely stand on my own right now. And now you want me to think about racism and trans people and all these things. I just want to teach my asana class. And so sometimes I see a bit of resistance around that too. And a lot of willingness and open-heartedness too. I don't think the resistance is the main thing.
Yeah.
People are struggling financially, like you say. How can I do all this and still make my yoga studio work or make my yoga classes work?
It's challenging, and there definitely is some overwhelm. And again, I think that one of the pieces that becomes particularly overwhelming is that we're often trying to figure out how to make our way in the world in isolation.
Mm-hmm.
We don't necessarily have sort of communities of yoga teachers getting together and sitting down and collectively saying, what can we do to support each other? What are you doing in this situation? What do you think I should do? How are you structuring sliding scale? What are you doing about cueing in this particular form? Like, I don't know that we have a ton of spaces like that act as a resource for yoga teachers. And it would be great if we did. I mean, some of the work that Yoga Outreach does facilitates those kinds of conversations. So I think that's really important. I mean, it's interesting, right? In the world of counseling, it's considered, unethical to some extent to be working without some sort of supervision, group and or individual. But yoga teachers who I think more and more are being seen as folks who hold space for trauma survivors don't have that.
Don't have that support, the connection, the knowledge and the wisdom that generates in between us when we're together. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. And again, like we create change collectively. I mean, you know this from all your work, right? Like we create change collectively. We don't do it in isolation. It's overwhelming when you're trying to do it alone. It's generative and exciting if you can do it in community. It's enlivening.
Right. So one of the things I wanted to ask you about was working with younger people, working with teens. What are you seeing? Like, my impression is that there's so much anxiety with teenagers right now. What are you seeing with teens as a whole, and maybe, 20s, 30s too, but what are you seeing?
First of all, I have to start this conversation off by disclosing to you that I was an incredibly difficult teenager. I got into a lot of trouble. So I have a very soft spot in my heart for the teens that I get to work with. Yeah, I have a lot of love and empathy for them. There's a lot of anxiety. It seems to me like there's an increase in anxiety. I'm also seeing an increase in diagnoses of things like ADHD. Now, whether that means, and you would probably know more about this than I, Lynn, whether that means that there's more frequency or it's just being diagnosed more, I'm not sure. Or if it's connected to population growth, I don't know. But just in terms of like a very much a layperson, what I'm seeing is that I think that we're really talking about a cohort who is living with a very different understanding of what the future might hold. I feel certainly like, as a 50-year-old sort of Gen Xer, I still perhaps naively always believed that there was like hope in the future. And I'm not totally sure that this generation of teens that I'm working with has that same sense of hope. So then this question, a sort of existential question of like, well, how are you going to live your life then, becomes particularly overwhelming. So yes, there's an increase in anxiety and increase in diagnoses of ADHD that I'm seeing, and also what looks sometimes like a loss of hope to some extent. Certainly with the teens that I'm working with, there's a lot of resistance around a lot of not just resistance, but like terror, anxiety around being embodied. So I think a lot of the kids that I'm working with have been making it through their lives and through the world by not being very connected to their bodies. Which is a very adaptive thing to do. And it also can create some problems. But there seems to be a lot of resistance around any kind of embodiment practice or moving one's body. Now, I am working with a very specific population of teens. They are teens who, for the most part, have a mental health diagnosis. So they're struggling in ways that we might not see in the general population. What about you? What do you see? Do you work with teens much?
Well, I have 3 grandchildren, 14 and 16 and 20. But I do work with a certain number of parents too who have children who are really highly stressed. And it does, I agree. I think there's a lot more anxiety and more isolation, even though, with all the social connections that people have. But I also see it's really good to get a diagnosis sometimes, because once you have a diagnosis of ADHD or whatever it might be,
Mm.
then there's some things that you can do. So it helps
Mhm.
to reduce the shame.
Mm.
Like there's something, I'm just a bad person, there's something wrong with me. No, it's actually, there's a certain way my brain works, and there are ways to work with that. But the question of what kind of a world are children living in? What's going to happen as they move into their adult lives? Gabor Mate in The Myth of Normal talks about we've created a culture and a society that's toxic to
Mm.
human beings.
Mm.
And so it's hard to blame someone for, spending hours on the computer on video games or whatever. It's like we're all doing that. And that with the increase in addiction during COVID, and addiction meaning shoe shopping online or, gaming or Netflix and all the ways that we escape our bodies and escape our lives. Why wouldn't we want to escape if things are that difficult?
Yeah.
That's a hard answer. What are we going to do? We need to be working to create a world that we can enjoy living in.
Yes. And embodiment practices need to be connected into the creation of that world. It can't be something separate.
Right, right. So if we have stored trauma in the body, we don't want to be in the body then. So do you want to talk a little bit about moving into more of a counseling role now too? What was it that inspired you to take your training on that and start into that?
Well, I have this master's degree in yoga therapy studies that I completed in 2010, and I love that work. And I've done well with that work. It served me well. But when the pandemic came, I thought, we're going to go into a recession.
Mhm.
I don't know what else is going to happen. But given that my work is not covered, that my work happens in person, that it happens in groups, and that it's not covered by medical, I predicted that the bottom would fall out of my work. So I thought, okay, well, what area seems to be doing well? And it looked like healthcare. And God knows I'm not going to become a nurse or a doctor. I don't have the brain for it. But I had always been interested in counseling. So I applied to this master's program and I got in. And interestingly, all of my work pivoted online basically.
Mhm.
So my private practice suffered a bit, but everything just went online. So I found myself in this pretty demanding for me, program. I'm not a superstar academic by any means. So I found myself in this pretty challenging program with people who are generally about 20 years younger than me and a full workload. So it's been great. It's been very humbling. It's been very challenging. It's a completely different way to work with people. Like I'm still a bit stunned, I think, when I come out of a session because in the work that I've been doing, we don't dive deep into people's stories. We don't do that.
Mhm.
And in this work, like that cognitive piece is so dominant and we're diving deep, deep into someone's story a lot of the time. So there's definitely a case of like beginner's mind happening over here. I have to keep bringing myself back to this place of like, I'm a student, I'm learning how to do this. I don't have to have any mastery in it. And it's challenging, because I've gained some mastery in something else.
Right. Right. Right.
And now I'm starting again, but I'm excited about combining the two. That's what I'm looking ahead to.
So what's your sense of what you're bringing in from your years of yoga therapy and working with people and trauma and addictions? How is that manifesting in the work that you're doing as counseling?
It's so interesting, Lynn, because I thought like when I started this program, I thought, I'm going to let go of the yoga entirely. I'm leaving behind the yoga therapy and I'm leaving behind the trauma work. And I'm going to open myself up to being a talk therapist with a different specialty. And what's it going to be? What's it going to be? And so during, my school, I'm like looking, will it be this? Will it be this? Maybe I'll work with couples, maybe I'll work with kids, et cetera, et cetera. And what I came to understand about a year and a half in was that the yoga therapy was a huge strength. I mean, from the outside, it might look like that it might look obvious to anyone else, but that's just, to me, I wasn't quite there. The yoga therapy is a really big strength, and the background in trauma and addictions is a big strength and a passion. So now it's been, how can I effectively combine these two? So I'm doing my internship under Brian Dean Williams. And, he really works from a narrative therapy approach. And I'm very interested in narrative therapy. So I'm looking at writing my capstone in the area of exploring combining narrative therapy and yoga therapy. So that's what I've very slowly been trying to do in my sessions, is hold yoga therapy as a way to address states of dysregulation or disembodiment, along with narrative therapy and exploring, life stories and how we live into those. I am definitely at the very beginning of it, though. I'll tell you, it is quite a trip. So that was a very long way of answering your question, but
I think that's fascinating, though. So, what's the difference between narrative therapy and talk therapy?
Well, I mean, it is talk therapy. Narrative therapy is, like any therapeutic approach, like CBT or something. It just has its own, it's constructivist. It has its own way of understanding how human beings see themselves, how they operate in the world, and, what creates suffering for them and what creates liberation. It's very social justice oriented. As I said, it's constructivist. It's postmodern in its approach. It wasn't created by psychologists, and it brings in influences. It was created by an anthropologist and another, I can't remember what the other person did. It brings in indigenous approaches from indigenous folks in Australia. It leans sort of heavily on some of the work of Michel Foucault. So I'm just learning about it.
Interesting. Yeah.
Stay tuned.
Well, Nicole, one of the things we can guarantee is that whatever it is you'll be doing it in your body as well. The whole somatic piece is something that is a huge strength.
Yeah.
So when you're working with trauma therapists or with any therapist who's doing really a talk therapy, and I'm seeing such a shift in that world towards understanding that it has to be somatic too, or people who are undergoing talk therapy, what's your sense of how we could make that more somatic? Is it just the therapist? Can people that are doing therapy also kind of work with it in a different way? What would be some ideas about that?
Again, a lot of my referrals come in from therapists who are wanting to do things like EMDR with their clients, but their clients can't regulate enough in order to do that work.
Oh, okay.
And so the work that I do with those folks is not complicated. Therapists can do that work with their clients. Maybe they're not interested in doing that, and I'm happy for the referrals, don't get me wrong. But I think that, and certainly I provide trainings like this, learning some real basics around how to bring the breath and the body into session in a trauma-informed way in order to support a client's ability to regulate is a really important piece. And again, it doesn't have to be complicated. My therapist, this is sort of at the other end of the spectrum, right? Like my therapist is a Hakomi practitioner. And she believes that the information that comes from the body is the real truth of the matter. that stuff that comes from cognition is not really at the root of the communication.
Mm-hmm.
So some therapists may be interested in going deeper into that kind of somatic work and really exploring meaning making from a somatic approach.
Mm-hmm.
Like, can you identify where you're feeling that in your body and exploring the emotions and ideas and memories associated with that feeling, and sometimes even speaking to that emotion, speaking to that experience. I think that somatic work is often utilized alongside like inner child work.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And then, again, my supervisor works somatically, it interweaves Buddhist psychological approaches with somatic work,
Mm-hmm.
which is interesting. So, locating emotion in the body, attending to, whatever that sensation or experience is, directing breath into and out of that sensation, noting how that sensation shifts, the emotion shifts. Yeah. When you stop, when you notice it, when you bring your breath to it, and having that be a reflection on impermanence. And then making, wise choice from there. So
Mm-hmm.
there's lots of interesting ways, I think, to incorporate somatic work. And again, I think it can go anywhere from being really, really simple, like let's get you regulated so that, we can engage in co-regulation and move forward with some other therapeutic approaches, to, I'm really just going to be speaking primarily to your body.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to have that conversation.
Right. Well, and I've noticed with people that oftentimes people will hold their breath, and just bringing awareness to the breath. I have someone I work with who I've known for 6 or 7 years. And she said, it took me probably 3 or 4 years to really notice when I was holding my breath, and then to consistently notice. And, so she's doing diaphragmatic breathing practices. So that helps to establish that as a habit. And yet, so many times when I'm working with someone, I'll mention, maybe you can take a breath now, because I can see that they're holding their breath, and it's, we're so, we have these habits of tightening down around things.
Yeah.
And so this nervous system regulation piece, I think, is a real basic foundation of being able to do any of the kind of work that we're talking about.
It seems that way, and it seems strange that it wouldn't be included given, that understanding. And so often I'll start a session by saying, one of the tools that I can offer is to stop the conversation sometimes and move into a practice to support grounding and staying present and regulating. Are you open to that? Are you interested in that?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important also for practitioners to remember that just noticing the breath can actually be very anxiety provoking for the majority of the population. So linking the movement of one's body with one's breath can be a really great starting point if that's the case for a client.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you work with the polyvagal system, the fight, flight, freeze? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do some work with that. I teach folks who are in trainings with me about polyvagal theory, and it's fascinating stuff.
It is. And that it comes from, with Stephen Porges being a medical researcher with babies in neonatal intensive care, and then the kind of the process of how that then came out into the trauma therapy world.
Mm-hmm. And he wasn't quite expecting that, I don't think.
So let's return. I know that we're getting close to the end of our time, but let's return for a moment to the social justice aspect of it. But what do you see as maybe something that you want to see in the future? Or one of the things you mentioned was that we need to be talking with each other so that we're not doing this in isolation, that it can be so overwhelming to do it in isolation. So if we're talking to yoga teachers or therapists or anybody who's like, I see the systemic oppression, I want to do something about it, and I don't feel like I can. what do you see as some, I don't know, some steps or some directions, or what would you say for people who are really feeling kind of powerless and overwhelmed around that, maybe, or maybe just frustrated, like this is a big system of oppression. How are we going to change that?
Mm. Yeah, I hear that a lot. I hear that a lot in the yoga community for sure. I think a starting point is starting to get curious about what it looks like to address and in some ways push back against the power imbalance that exists within the therapeutic relationship
Oh,
and exists in a teacher student relationship. So, if we're talking about yoga teachers, right? So, starting to understand those dynamics more. There's a power imbalance there, and becoming more aware of where are the places where I'm perpetuating that imbalance and where are the places where I'm pushing back against it, and how can I do that? Again, I think consulting with other therapists and consulting with other yoga teachers is a good idea. So it does require that somebody be committed enough to that change to initiate something. But I kind of think to myself, like for me, anyways, like I've got about as much unearned privilege as I can get. So part of my work is to get up underneath those kinds of things and make them happen. So I feel exhausted and discouraged just as much as anyone else, but I also see that I have something in addition. So I've got to be at the source of that sometimes. I'm okay with that. So that's a pretty basic way to start. And then I often am referring people to organizations that they can support, like Yoga Outreach or the Black Yoga Therapist Fund or the Black Therapist Fund, excuse me, they're not yoga therapists, or Healing in Color or the Indigenous Yoga Collective. Like, if that's what you're up for, is putting some of your resources towards organizations that are doing the work, great. So, on a very basic level, checking out your own privilege, your own power out in the world and in your professional relationships, unpacking that and getting more real about that. And then on a larger level, supporting organizations that are doing important work.
right. I know one of the ones that I've been kind of tracking like the last couple of years is the Embodiment Institute, Apprentice Hemphill, their work. They're holding space for BIPOC and for nurturing a community of Black therapists and organizers and activists, and how, as a white person, I can support that financially, even though I'm not going to be part of that work, but I can be part of it by supporting it financially. So I like that is something that we can do.
Another piece also, I like that too. And I think another piece is recognizing, like for me right now, I'm in this transition where I'm stepping out of a lot of roles that I've previously held and really making sure that whoever is coming into that role, whoever I'm giving that job to or that work to, is someone who does not have the same level of privilege that I do. That might be someone who's differently abled or neurodivergent or BIPOC or something, but really making sure that anything that I'm vacating, that somebody else is stepping into, that might not necessarily get the opportunity to step into it. And also handing some stuff off. Like, I get offered work, and rather than always saying yes, connecting, somebody else in. So taking a step back and getting behind someone else and putting them forward.
Right. And using your networks to do that.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. And that's been some of the most satisfying work that I've been able to do, is to say, hey, like, do you want this gig? I can walk you through it. I'll be a resource for you if anything comes up around it. But, why don't you take this over? And,
Oh,
that's felt good to be able to hand that over to someone else and let somebody else take the reins with it.
So when is it that you're going to be finished your program and out there in the world?
Well, they've already unleashed me out into the world. Well, I'm doing my practicum, so I'm seeing clients. And I should be done by next fall, so fall 2023.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll tell you, it is quite a trip learning a new vocation in one's 50s. It is quite a trip.
How can people get a hold of you? Let's let people know how they can get in touch with you.
Yeah, absolutely. They can get in touch with me through my website, which is Counselling and Yoga. They can also email me at NicoleM@FineBalanceYoga.ca. That's fine as in feeling fine, not find as in finding something.
That's wonderful. And a lot of the work that you're doing as you're moving into counseling will be a little bit more specific to working with people. Are you working with people online, like from all over the place, or is it really specifically in British Columbia?
It's in British Columbia, and I'm working with people online and in person. I have an office in East Vancouver.
Oh, okay.
Which you're actually looking at right now.
Oh, awesome.
This is it.
That's great.
Yeah. Yeah, and I have a yoga therapy space here as well, so it works pretty well.
Great. Well, over the years, I've really enjoyed watching what it is that you're doing, and what you bring, the integrity that you bring, and the broad base of understanding and inclusion, and just recognizing. I'm not surprised to hear you talking about systemic oppression and kind of to broaden out our work to include all of that. So, yeah, thank you very much. It's been great.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching the Radical Recovery Summit 2023. To watch more of the interviews and the clips, and to share with your friends, please go to radicalrecoverysummit.com.